Hello and welcome to a video on dynamic outdoor cinematics in Unreal Engine. It's going to be a long one, so I have a coffee, I suggest you grab one too, and we'll get started. I am using Unreal Engine version 4.26, and although some of the more advanced features might not work in previous versions, the general concepts should still apply. Here we have a scene that is the culmination of the past few videos where we built a basic landscape using the landscape sculpt tool and then painted on some materials using a custom built landscape material. Then we brought in some assets from Quicksort Bridge and painted them onto the landscape using the foliage tool, and lastly made a simple water material using the single layer water material type. The goal of today is to take something that looks like this, even if your scene is the replication of this, and turn it into something that looks like this. That clip is the output of this video, so hopefully it all came together okay. Before I begin, I would like to point out that I am using ray tracing. My project is ray tracing enabled. It's not necessary for you to have ray tracing, but it will help get the most accurate reflections and shadows. So if you have a ray tracing capable GPU, you can turn on ray tracing in your project by going to the project settings, typing ray tracing. Enabling ray tracing, it'll tell you that you need to restart. Don't restart just yet, because you also need to enable something called default RHI. You need to set the default RHI to DirectX 12. Then you'll need to restart Unreal and also make sure that your graphics drivers are up to date. If you have older graphics drivers, Unreal might not recognize and might not enable ray tracing for your project. Once you've restarted, you should then see in your drop-down window a new option called Path Tracing and Ray Tracing Debug, and if you don't, double check that your graphics drivers are up to date. If your graphics card doesn't allow ray tracing, or your target platform is not a ray tracing capable platform, you can still follow along. That's totally fine. The general concepts of this video should still apply. The other caveat that I'll say before I begin is that my goal is not necessarily the most performant project. I am trying to output a movie file at the end, so I'm not super worried about real-time performance. If you're creating something that's more of a game or that's going to run in real time, I will mention throughout a couple of balancing tips, but I'm going for quality over performance. But of course, it is always a balance when it comes to this sort of thing. All right, without further ado, let's get started. In the scene, I have a really basic lighting setup with a post-processing volume, a blueprint sky sphere, and a directional light. I'm going to delete them all and just start from scratch so that I have the ultimate control over this project. And of course, my scene immediately goes dark because I need at least a directional light in the scene, which I'll bring in and then set to 0, 0, 0. Also, because my light is going to be animating over the course of the clip, I cannot set it to stationary. I'm going to choose movable, and that's probably what you need in general if you have an outdoor scene that changes over time. Stationary means that you cannot change the position or rotation of that light, and we need to change the rotation. The next thing that I'm going to do before I start messing around with the lights at all is prevent the auto exposure metering. So by default, when you don't disable it, Unreal will try to compensate for lower and higher levels of lighting in your scene. For instance, at the moment, my light intensity is at 10 lux, but if I change that down to 1 and hit enter, the scene goes dark for a bit and then fades back in. And that's the auto exposure metering compensating for the lower lighting conditions. Because I want full control over my lighting, I don't want this auto exposure metering. You see there, brightened and then fades back down. So to prevent the auto exposure metering, I'm going to add in a post-processing volume and just reset that to 0, 0, 0. But it doesn't matter where it is, because the next thing that I'm going to do is type either unbounded or extent, one of these three words into the search bar in the details panel, and check unbound. And that means that no matter where our camera is in the scene, the effects of this post-processing volume will apply. So we're going to use this to apply the general effects and settings for our scene, which means that I might actually rename that to something like post-processing global. All right, now we have to hunt for the exposure metering settings, which are buried somewhere in here, but we can also find them just by searching for exposure. And the metering mode is auto exposure histogram, which we're going to keep as it is. And then our minimum and maximum brightness are the two things that we want to change. For now, I'm just going to set at 1 and 1. But if your scene does have a little bit of light variation that you want to balance, you can start playing around with these sliders and have something that is a little bit less intense, but at least allows you some sort of exposure metering. Great, now that we know that our exposure is locked in at 1, we can start to add lights and change the lights in our scene, knowing that what we see is what we get. I'm going to try and be a little bit organized with this project, so I'm going to move both the light and the post-processing into my lighting folder. And when I add new lights, I'm going to try remember to put them in there. Okay, so we have a light, and if we want to rotate the light, we can go to the rotate tool and start moving it about using the general rotation tools. However, there is another way to move the light, which I find a lot more convenient, because in this case we do have to have the light selected and we have to be in the rotate tool, and it's a lot of buttons to click and press. If we select this directional light, and then in the details panel search for atmosphere, the first option that comes up is atmosphere sunlight. And the description of this is whether to treat this light as the main sunlight of your scene. We can, in fact, have more than one atmosphere sunlight. If you have a moon in your scene, or you're doing twin suns or something like that, you can do that. But for now, we're just using one, so we'll check that. And that does a whole bunch of stuff on the back end, linking this light to the atmospheric fog, if there is any, which we don't have. But the reason that I've done it right now is so that I can press Ctrl L in my scene and move around. This new gizmo appears. Basically, this gizmo shows the XYZ axes as well as this purple line, which indicates the sun's direction. And as I start moving and dragging my mouse around, the sunlight itself, because it's linked as the main atmospheric sunlight, is moving around with my mouse. This tool does take a second to get used to. As I move my mouse left and right, the sun rotates about the world's z-axis, and then when I move my mouse up and down, the sun raises and lowers on the horizon along the axis that it's currently rotated around. So it's not your usual rotate tool, but after a little bit of time playing around with it, you'll probably get used to it pretty quickly. And it's a very handy, useful tool, because no matter what you have selected in the scene, you can just press Ctrl L and it will bring up this gizmo. So you don't have to select your light directly to be able to change it, and you don't have to be in the rotate tool. You can be in whatever tool. And I think even if you're in the landscape editor, for example, you can move things around, seeing how your landscape works with your sunlight as you're moving things around. Amazing. So now we have a sunlight that we can move around the scene using our Ctrl L tool widget, whatever it's called. However, there is some weird stuff happening with the shadows. Because my project is using ray tracing, by default, the shadows being cast by this light are being ray traced. And we can toggle that by going to our directional light, and under the lighting tab, where is it? Here we go. Under the light tab, if we hit the drop down advanced menu, scroll all the way to the bottom, we have an option to turn ray tracing shadows on or off. You can toggle between ray tracing shadows or not, and in my case, when I don't have the shadows enabled, Unreal will fall back to cascaded shadow maps, which, from my experience, work a little bit better with foliage. Your mileage may vary, and you might find that your scene works wonderfully with ray traced shadows. More power to you. For the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to keep ray traced shadows off and only use the other types of shadows, which we'll talk about in a second, because that is likely what more people will be using, and also I have been having some trouble with foliage, especially when there's a lot of foliage, and ray traced shadows. Great, so once we've turned our ray traced shadows off, the shadow system will now fall back to cascaded shadows, and you can sort of see what that looks like if we move our light to be coming quite incidentally from the front. So the light's coming from over there. When I move far enough away, the shadows of all this grass disappear, and it becomes a very harsh line of where the grass is casting shadows and then where the grass is not casting shadows. And if you look very carefully, you might not even be able to see it with this grass, but there is also a line, a sort of intermediary line, where the shadows move from being really sharp and thick and distinct to being a little bit softer on the outside. And that's because what the cascaded shadow map is doing is cascading the shadow maps. It's in the name, meaning that shadows that are really close to you, or objects that are really close to you, are casting crisp, clear shadows, and then further away, those objects are casting a little bit less detailed shadows. And this is a way to save on the processing power, because shadows far away are probably not super detailed anyway. The options for this type of shadow map is under the light settings, cascaded shadow maps. And we have a couple of options here. The most useful is the first one, dynamic shadow distance. When we start dragging that option down, that line of where the shadows cut off becomes less. So this distance, the actual number here, is the distance away that the shadow map will cease. And then everything in between that will be that cascaded version of really high definition shadows, medium, low, and then off. One thing to note is the lower this value, the crisper your close-up shadows will be. Let's take a look at that. So let's move to somewhere right by this grass. And as we move the cascaded shadow distance down, you'll see that the shadow cast by these blades of grass becomes really, really crisp. And as I move it further away, they sort of fade out a little bit. And that's because there's only a certain amount of memory for these shadow maps to be saved to. So the further away your shadow map ends, the less clear your close-up shadows will be. In this case, for this specific project, I don't need super crisp shadows really close up. I'm only dealing with grass, which means that I don't necessarily need super sharp shadows. I don't have any objects in my scene like trees, which are going to be very noticeable if they cast blocky shadows. So what I'm going to do is sacrifice the close-up crispness of my shadows for the distance of this shadow field, because I don't want, what's happening right now is the grass in the distance is very noticeably not casting shadows. And I'm going to increase the distance of my shadow map to, let's try 30,000. And it looks like that has created a map that's distant enough to stop that weird cutoff that I was getting. Let's also move the light to be coming in from this direction. Alright, so it looks there as though the grass is being highlighted again. So I'm going to go back into my shadow distance and move that up to 40,000. And now I have shadows really, really far away, but also the shadows that are close up don't look too bad. They're okay. If I was to linger on one of them, they would probably look a little blocky, but for the purposes of what I want, that's absolutely fine. Ultimately, this will always be a balance, and you'll have to play around with the distance that your shadow field extends to versus the crispness of the shadows that you need close up. There is another option in terms of shadowing just below cascaded shadow maps called distance field shadows. If you have a project that has a lot of meshes in the distance field shadows will cast sort of blobby, good enough shadows beyond this threshold. Do note that to enable this type of distance field shadowing, you do need to go into your project settings and set generate mesh distance fields and check that. If you do that, you require a project restart as it rebuilds your project mesh distance fields. Once you've done that, you can go to show, visualize, mesh distance fields, and so far I only have one mesh in my scene, so this isn't particularly exciting, but every single mesh in your scene will have this sort of volume distance field around it, and the distance field shadowing uses these fields to cast blocky volume-based shadows into your scene. They don't work great for close-up, but they are good and really fast for very far away shadows. And that is why if your project has a lot of... Oh, yeah, I should have pointed out the mesh that I have is a log. If your project has a lot of meshes which are casting shadows, then you might want to look into blending into both cascade shadow maps for stuff that's relatively close, and then distance field shadows for things that are further away than that. Okay, let's brush through some of these other settings that we haven't looked at just yet, but I won't spend too long on this. Hopefully we can get to atmospherics pretty soon. Rendering is just the general rendering tab, has nothing to do with the light itself. Light mass is for lights that are not dynamic, lights that are baked. So light mass is the way to bake those lights. Because we're not baking any lights, we don't even have to open light mass. Light shafts is an option for us to get those sort of volumetric type God rays coming through trees and things like that. At the moment, this won't really do anything because it really works in tandem with the atmospherics and the skybox. So I will revisit that later on once we have an atmosphere. The shadow maps we've gone through. Ray tracing, I am not going to worry too much about ray tracing right now because I'm not using ray tracing shadows. Atmosphere and clouds, the only thing we're doing at the moment is linking the light itself to the atmosphere that we are going to create in a second. And the rest of the tabs we don't really have to worry about either. That's a brief overview of what's available to us in terms of the directional light in the specific context of an outdoor dynamic scene where we need our lights to change over time. Great, so now we have a sunlight in our scene that we can move around using the main sunlight tool. I don't know if this tool has an actual name. It's just Control L in my mind. But we still have a long way to go. We have a sun, but no atmosphere, no fog, no clouds, no effects. So let's get started rectifying that. We do have a couple of options when it comes to skies, and I will talk about the default ones here. One way to bring in a sky is to search for atmosphere, and the options that come up are atmospheric fog and sky atmosphere. They sound very similar, and they do similar things. If we drag in the atmospheric fog and wait for a second, we'll see that we have a beautiful daytime sky with our directional light linked as the direction that the sun is coming from. If I use my Control L tool to start moving the light around, the sun disk follows that light, and if we rotate to the horizon, we'll get sort of sunsetty colors. And that's because what the purpose of this atmospheric fog is to simulate the way that light enters our atmosphere, bounces through the atmosphere, and then reaches us. There are a couple of options in the atmospheric fog details panel, which I won't go into right now because we're not actually going to use atmospheric fog. I'm going to delete that from my scene and drag in the sky atmosphere instead. And that looks pretty similar because it does the same thing. It simulates the way that light reaches us through the atmosphere. However, sky atmosphere is the newer implementation of this, and it has a lot more of a robust and accurate feature set to it. Similar to the atmospheric fog, if I move my sunlight around, the sun disk responds. As I move my sun towards the horizon, we get a sunset with a beautiful orange to red hue to it. There are a number of options for us to explore under the details panel of the sky atmosphere. so many options that it becomes a little bit overwhelming, and some of these become very technical, such as the Rayleigh scattering and the me scattering. Me scattering. The two options that I use the most are planet and art direction. Planet giving us an option to change the size of the world that we're on, and then art direction giving us some overall knobs to tweak in terms of the color of the sky, the brightness of the sky, etc., etc. So perhaps you're on an alien world and the sky is yellow, or you're in a very polluted part of the world. Whatever. One thing to note, which is quite fun to see visualized, is with the planet option, if our planet becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, actually let me demonstrate this another way. Using the sunset tool, or using the sun movement tool, I'm going to move the sun below the horizon, and at the default level, the sky gets dark pretty quickly, so at about 5 or 10 degrees below the horizon. But if we were to go back to the sky atmosphere and reduce the size of the planet we're on to something like 1,000, I believe this is kilometers. Yeah, kilometers from the center to the ground level. Now if I do that same thing and move the sun towards the horizon, we get a lot more give below the horizon before our sky turns dark. And if our sky atmosphere is much smaller than that, if our planet is really, really tiny, then our nighttime is a lot shorter because we have more light bouncing around in towards us. So the way that it works is, to me at least, incredibly accurate, especially for something that is real time. The last thing that I'll show you on the sky atmosphere for now, which is another little fun detail, is if we move our camera speed way up and turn my speed scaler way up so I can zoom super far above my map, you can begin to see the horizon of the world. And this is very, very pronounced because my ground radius is really small at the moment. But if we go back to the default, which I believe is the radius of the Earth, if we go far up enough, we begin to see the horizon curve of the Earth. So you can create a scene, game, experience, what have you, where you go really high up and see the horizon of the Earth as you would from space, which is really cool. Obviously, we don't have the ground at the moment. This is just the horizon. Okay, I'm going to go back to the ground, reset my camera speed to something that's reasonable. And that's that on the sky atmosphere. In summary, I strongly suggest using the sky atmosphere, which is the newer version, over the atmospheric fog, which is the older version. That's all well and good, and we have a pretty awesome sky that is connected to our sun that can give us some beautiful sunsets with a lot of knobs to tweak in terms of how we want our skies to look. However, the big limiting factor is that this sky does not include any clouds. Depending on what your situation is, you might need to import your own clouds as assets or materials, but if you just want a sort of standard background moving cloud situation, there is one other thing that we can do for our skyboxes, which is bring in a blueprint underscore skysphere. So search for BP skysphere, and if we drag that into our scene, suddenly everything changes and we have a much more orange sky. And just so that we're not confused about what's happening, I'm going to turn off my sky atmosphere. So I'm hiding that, and what I have now is a different type of skybox. And if you look carefully, depending on how YouTube has compressed this video, you might be able to start seeing some clouds in the distance. The blueprint skysphere, if we look around, we'll see a sun disk, but that is not in the location that I would expect my sun disk to be. My sun is coming from up there somewhere, and the sun disk is coming from the side. That's because the blueprint skysphere links to the sun a little bit differently than the sky atmosphere. Inside the blueprint skysphere details panel, there is a drop-down tab called default, with an option to refresh material and an option to change the directional light acting. And this is where we need to set what light is our sunlight. Again, it's a little bit redundant, but that's because this blueprint sky sphere is not linked to the atmospheric system that we were just looking at. So we have to set the directional light, and then the sun does go away and moves back to where our sunlight is coming from. That's amazing. However, another big limitation of this blueprint sky sphere, when I use my sun moving tool, the sun is moving, but the sun disk isn't moving, and the sky itself is not updated. And that's because this sky sphere does not auto update. We do have to come in and hit refresh material once we've made changes to our lights. So this version isn't as dynamic, although I will talk about ways to get around this in a little bit. However, what this version does offer is, as I briefly touched upon, the option for clouds, and if we move our sun below the horizon and refresh that material, the option for a pretty basic night sky. So with my sun all the way at the bottom, we've got our night sky with some clouds. And there you can see the clouds a little bit more clearly. So coming in, bringing the sun back up to the daytime, refreshing the material. We've got some clouds, and let's have a look at the options that are open to us. The third option in this list is colors determined by sun position. And that's pretty self-explanatory. Whether the sky itself, once we hit refresh material, is determined by the position of the sun or not. If it's not determined by the position of the sun, what is it determined by? These override settings. So here we have zenith color, horizon color, and cloud color, as well as overall color. And I can say, you know what, I want my sky to be real deep blue up at the top. Zenith referring to the bit of the sky that's directly above you, and then the horizon referring to the sky that's at eye level. So we could change that to something that's a little bit more yellowish orange. And choose the sun height and horizon fall off to tweak these parameters a little. So this is a way to, sun height is unable to move. I guess sun height is locked to the position of the sun. But we can use the horizon fall off and all of these color options to tweak the blueprint sky sphere a little bit more. If you're using the blueprint sky sphere, the colors determined by sun position is a good default to have, unless you have a really specific and stylistic sky in mind, in which case you might want to use the override settings. The other options that are here available to us are the sun brightness, which controls the brightness of the disk itself that's generated automagically behind the scenes. The cloud speed, which affects the speed of these clouds drifting by. If we turn it up to something outrageous, the clouds will zip by super speedily. And one is a sort of more, one means that the clouds will drift lazily by. Cloud opacity is the way to ultimately increase or decrease the brightness of the clouds, which will sort of depend on what time of day your scene is at, because something that's at night with an opacity of 1 might seem a little bit too bright, whereas during the day that might suit you just fine. And lastly, the star's brightness. So when we move the sun below the horizon, in fact coming directly from underneath the world, and hit refresh material, and colors determined by sun position, then we have this night sky where we can increase the star's brightness. The one thing that I would note is that the sky is just a repeated texture of stars over and over. If your stars are too bright, it might become a little obvious, that repetition. The 0.1 is a nice default subtle. There's some stars there, but they're not too bright. Hello, it's me from the future. One thing that you might notice at this point is that depending on your project setup, you might see when your light dips below the horizon that shadows are cast from the underside of your landscape, which looks pretty weird. For instance, here I've got my light just below the horizon casting shadows from underneath the world onto the water plane and onto the world itself, which doesn't look great at all. Ultimately, you don't need to worry about that for this demo, because once we activate the sky atmosphere, the planet, the sky atmosphere algorithm itself, casts a shadow, gets rid of that light that comes in from underneath. But if you're not using the sky atmosphere, I might as well show you one way to begin to get around that. So here I have lights coming in from the just below the horizon, casting shadow onto my landscape. Go to the landscape, and under search details, search for 2, and say shadow 2-sided. Once you enable that, both sides of the material, both the front and the back, will try to block light as best as they can, and you should stop seeing those shadows coming in from the underneath. There is still a little bit of light coming in from underneath on the foliage that I have in my scene, and that is a little bit more complex of a problem. The easiest way to get around that is when your light is below the horizon, set the light intensity to 0. That's the quickest hack workaround. As I mentioned, ultimately for the purposes of this video, it's not super important because when we enable the sky atmosphere, that blocks the light coming from underneath anyway. Alright, back to the rest of the atmospherics. Where were we? We were talking about the sky sphere. Great. So the blueprint sky sphere, you have to refresh the material every time you move the light, but it does offer us a couple of clouds and a nighttime scene as well. What would be amazing is if we could use both the sky sphere and the sky atmosphere together and take the advantage of the sky atmosphere's realistic scattering and the sky sphere's nighttime and clouds. We can do that, but it comes at a little bit of a cost. If I turn back on my sky atmosphere and move my sun into the sort of daylight position, it looks to me as if the sky atmosphere is sort of working. I can turn it off and turn it on, and we've got some clouds in the distance, and we've got a sky, and it looks like there's some stars in the sky, but I might need to go to my sky sphere and refresh the material. And once I do that, there's this sort of overbright blend between the sky sphere and the sky atmosphere. So without the atmosphere, this is what we have, and without the sky sphere, this is what we have. So they're sort of blending on top of each other a little too much. What I found works for me is to remove the influence of the sky sphere's actual sky, so the reds and the blues from the sky, and only keep the clouds and the stars. To do that, we'll go back into our sky sphere details panel and uncheck colors determined by sun position. So this time we don't want the colors determined by sun position, we want to be using these override settings. And I'm going to turn the zenith and the horizon color all the way down to 0. Let's turn off the sky atmosphere just to see what that looks like. One thing that I didn't really make clear earlier is that the sun disk, once we refresh the material, still comes from the direction that the sun is coming from. It's just these colors, the zenith and the horizon, that are no longer determined by where the sun is in the sky. If we don't uncheck that, then there's no way that we can use these override settings. So we need to have colors determined by sun position unchecked, and then set the zenith and the horizon color at 0. Turning the sky atmosphere back on, it looks like we're getting there. So when I move my sun around, I still have to refresh the blueprint material to get the sun's position to update, but otherwise we are getting a little bit of a decent sky. And when we come in from the evening or nighttime, as long as our sun is directly coming in from underneath, we should be able to start seeing the stars as well using our blueprint sky sphere. There they are. They're pretty faint, but we can increase them. There they are. I'm going to set that at 0.2 for now. All that said, however, let's bring the sun back into the daytime, refresh the material. There is a problem, and that is, if I toggle my sky atmosphere, it looks like it's working, but when I toggle my blueprint sky sphere, it becomes noticeable that some things are different. The intensity of the sun, for example, and the brightness of some of the blues. Let's go into our sky atmosphere and turn down the clouds to 0, just to show you what I mean. Toggling the sky sphere, there's a lot that we lose out on. That horizon sort of bloom, the bloom around the sun, the brightness from the sun of the horizon. If we look at what the sky sphere is by clicking on the sky sphere and pressing F, it is essentially just a really, really, really big sphere that points inward. That is the culling point of our camera. And what's happening here is that the sky atmosphere works based on distance. So without the sky sphere, the distance is infinite, and the calculations are happening across basically an infinite distance, as far as they can. But when we have the sky sphere, there's now a barrier that's reducing the amount that these scattering effects are being applied over. So one way to get around this is to increase that distance that the light gets to travel before hitting the sky sphere. And the way to do that is to go to that sky sphere, hit transform, and just increase this by a certain factor. I'm going to choose 10 as an arbitrary tweaking parameter. And now you can see that we've got that little bloom coming in on the horizon. We still don't really have the sun bloom. So let's try set that to 100. Still don't have the sun bloom, and it looks like not much else changed. And we could set it to 1,000 or 10,000, but we're not getting enough of a change to make this scale difference worth it. So it looks like the difference between 10 and 100 is basically not really noticeable. So what if we go to 5? Oops, 5. Okay, when we move from 10 to 5, we start darkening on the edges. So it seems like 10 is the sort of sweet spot between making the sky sphere really big and actually having enough area for these scattering effects to come into effect. So now when I toggle my sky sphere, we don't notice all that much of a difference, except for the sun, which is unfortunately just what we have to deal with. Perhaps we could reduce the sun brightness. Yeah, it doesn't really work like that. When we move the sun brightness, we still lose out on that disk. So it seems as though a scale of 10 on the sky sphere, the blueprint sky sphere, is enough, gives enough space that it does not interfere too much with the sky atmosphere. The only caveat to this is that we do lose out a little bit on that soft-edged sun that's coming in from the sky atmosphere, but what we get in return, if I just set the sun back here to 50, is the option to add clouds to our scene, and also the option to add a nighttime version of our scene, oopsie, while still making use of the sky atmospheric effects, all of that soft, gorgeous scattering. If your scene requires something more of your clouds, more than beyond this default setup that you have here, or you really don't want to sacrifice any accuracy of the sky atmosphere whatsoever, then you might need to start looking for more unique solutions to your project, specifically bringing in cloud assets, creating your own cloud materials, things like that. For the moment, as a default, as a playground, this setup works well for me, using the sky atmosphere and just the clouds and the stars from the sky sphere itself. Don't forget, for now, every time we change the sun's location, we do have to refresh the material of the sky sphere just to update where that sun is coming from. Fantastic. Now I have a atmospheric system linked to the main light of my scene that works reasonably well. Unfortunately, every time I move the light, I do have to refresh the blueprint sky sphere, but what I get in return is the ability to create some clouds in my scene, and under the sky sphere settings, adjust the opacity of those clouds. And I think I'm going to set my clouds at a nice little subtle 0.6. The next thing that I want to tackle is the fact that when my sun is high up in the sky, the landscape looks pretty decent. But when my sun is coming in from the horizon, the shadows that I get in these very occluded areas are quite dark. They're much darker than I would anticipate, and that's because there's no light coming in from the sky. The only thing that is lighting the ground in the scene currently is the sunlight itself. So where the sunlight is not hitting is pitch black. The way to bring up those ambient areas and have a sort of ambient light that's coming from the entire skybox is to use what's called a skylight. So bring in the skylight into your scene, and already we can see that it fills in those areas of darkness quite wonderfully without really any additional adjustment at all. What this light is doing is it's looking around the sky, sampling every single point of the sky and saying what color light should be coming from that direction. So for example, right now the sky is for the most part blue. So all of the light that's coming in is blue. But if we really exaggerated our sunset and had very deep oranges coming in from that side and more bluish purples coming in from the top, at the moment our scene hasn't changed, and that's because just like with the sky sphere, with the skylight, we do have to refresh or resample what the capture that skylight is making. So with the skylight selected, if we scroll all the way down, there's an option deep in these settings called recapture. If we hit recapture, now we have ambient oranges coming in from the side of orange, and in this area a little bit of blue coming in from the top of the sky. It might not be super obvious because that sky is quite dark at the moment. You might have noticed that I skipped entirely over the real-time capture option under the skylight. And the real-time capture option is great. That's what we're going to be using now, with the caveat that every single frame resampling the entire sky is a little bit heavy on performance. So if you are looking for something that's a bit more performant, you might not want to real-time capture. Just capture your scene once, especially if it doesn't change. But because our scene is changing, I am going to enable real-time capture. And now, as I move my light around the sky, the darker areas, the shadows fill in. So right now the shadows are all nice and bright blue, and then as we get towards sunset, the shadows fill in with those oranges and reds. One thing to note, when I move the light, the capture does take a second to catch up, so it's not super responsive, and it's probably best for slower lighting changes rather than something that's a rapid shift. But for the purposes of what I want to do, which is slowly move the sun across the sky, it's perfect. Real-time capture on our skylight is the option that I'm going to choose. Just to touch on some of the other options here open to you, the cube map resolution is the quality of the image that the skybox captures. Because my scene has rough normals and bumpiness in this reflection, and I'm only trying to get the general quality of the light, the general color, we can use a very low cube map resolution. As with everything else, the higher the quality, the slower your scene will be. Another option that can be useful is the intensity scale. If you have a scene where your skybox is just not cutting it, when you increase the intensity, it will bring up the general ambient intensity of your whole scene. So obviously 47 is quite a lot, but I can raise the general ambient color of my scene by using this intensity scale. Be careful with the setting because ambient light can make your scene look very flat. So unless there's a very strong reason, I would suggest keeping it at 1. Fantastic. Now we have a scene that has an atmosphere, as well as a couple of rudimentary clouds, which I have to manually update, and a general skylight that's coming in from all over, meaning that we have shadows which don't look too dark, and the reflections in our water look pretty good as well in terms of the sky. I'm getting decent reflections from the ground as well, just because I'm using ray tracing, but in the case that you're not using ray tracing, you will still have decent reflections. I can turn off my ray tracing reflections by going to the post-processing option and changing the reflection type to screen space. So if you're not using ray tracing, you might have something that looks like this, which uses screen space reflections, which are very accurate reflections and also easy on performance. The main cost of screen space reflections is that they can only reflect what is currently in the frame. So if I move my camera further down, the top of the mountain is being chopped off, the top of the hill is being chopped off. The water cannot reflect what is outside of the camera. So they do come at a bit of a cost. In my case, I'm going to turn my reflections back to ray traced reflections in my post-processing volume. So now I don't have that limitation of screen space reflections. Now that I have my atmosphere, let's clean up the scene hierarchy a little bit. Just move these into the lighting folder so that everything is clean. Now that I have my atmosphere, let's revisit that lighting option we skipped over earlier, called light shafts. Select the directional light, go to light shafts, and we have light shaft occlusion and light shaft bloom. If we enable both of those, we get a little bit of what's happening in the scene. First of all, we'll need to refresh the material of the sky sphere. Always be refreshing. And now we have a little bit of bloom, but the power of these light shafts comes when something is occluded in the scene. So for instance, if I bring my camera down a little bit, as I move my light down towards sunset, you can start to see that we have these sometimes called God rays, atmospheric rays, volumetric rays in our scene, being occluded by all the different geometry. There is a weird thing happening with the sky sphere, the disk that the sky sphere creates, but just know that that is because we haven't refreshed the material. Once we do, we get a very intense bloom where that light is coming from. So the first thing to note is that bloom is a little bit too intense. You might want to play around with these light shaft settings. Don't worry about the occlusion, that's just blending these light shafts with the sort of atmospherics and the fog that we're about to add. But the settings that you want to adjust are under light shaft bloom. The bloom scale and the threshold are the two that you might want to adjust first. Threshold adjusts at which brightness these light shafts are being emitted, and then the scale is in the end the actual brightness of the shafts. One thing that I have found is that the sun disk created by the sky sphere is, on the scale of this bloom, quite bright. So if you are going to be using light shafts, you might want to go back into the sun sphere and turn down the sun brightness. And as you turn that down, we will cut down the intensity of the bloom cast by the sun disk. Once we turn the intensity of that sky sphere disk down so that it's not overpowering the entire scene, we can go back to the directional light and start adjusting the bloom scale. I found that 0.1 works relatively nicely, perhaps 0.05, because sometimes less is more and you want to be a little bit subtle with this sort of thing. If you don't want to be subtle, go ahead, 0.2, and then as you move your light down, you get some really intense blooms, which might be your aesthetic. 0.05 is what I'm going to choose. See what that looks like with a refreshed material. Yeah, we have a nice subtle glow coming from the sun. There is also the option to tint the bloom a little bit if you knew that you wanted a golden, sort of more golden rays, but I'm going to keep it at its default of no tint. The last thing that I'll mention in terms of these light shafts is I bring this up in the context of atmospherics and volumetrics. These are volumetric light rays, but they're not actually volumetric light rays. They simulate light that's coming through a sort of dusty environment. But all this is doing is taking the intensity of a specific light point and blurring it out in a radius across the screen. So it's a bit of a hack, it's a cheat, it's not true volumetrics. But in many cases, it works just as well, and it's a lot faster, it's a lot more performant. So I would say test around to see if you could get the desired look from light shafts before doing something a little bit more advanced, such as what we are about to get into, which is exponential height fog. Our scene is coming together really well. We have a sky that responds to the position of our light, and now we also have light rays that give us a little bit of a sense of depth to our scene, that there is some air that this light is moving through, and perhaps it's dusty air. But let's lean into that a little bit more and add some either fog or mist or dust, some sort of dense air that's close. So our sky atmosphere is dealing with the light that's far away, the light that's bouncing through the atmosphere. But what about the light that's closer to the ground? Or what about the atmosphere that's closer to the ground? The mist, the dust, and the fog around us. If we search for fog, we have two types of fog: atmospheric fog, which we covered earlier, as well as exponential height fog. So exponential height fog, if we drag it into our scene, a lot of stuff happens. It's a single layer of fog, starting from the ground and moving upwards, decreasing in intensity as it moves up. So it's thickest along the ground, and it sort of thins out as it gets further up. You can't really change that. You can't have fog that's thin on the ground and then increases in thickness. Or at least you can't using exponential height fog. The height fog will always be thickest at the ground level. Alright, so we bring this in and then zero out the location. The location of the height fog is quite important because the starting point of that height fall off will be at the location of the height fog itself. So if we were to move the height fog up and down, that would change the way that our fog looks, because we are creating a more dense area of fog at the ground level. My recommendation is to have the height fog at the ground level, at the zero level of your scene, which in my case is this layer of water. So I will move this widget down just so that it's kissing the water gently. The default settings that come in are a little bit arbitrary. There's a density of 0.02 and a height fall-off of 0.2. These two settings, along with the in-scattering color, are probably the three biggest settings that you will be adjusting. The density refers to how thick the actual mist is, and the height fall-off refers to how quickly that thinning out process happens. So how rapid the fall-off along the height is. All these names are very self-descriptive. In this case, increasing the height fall-off very clearly demonstrates that at the highest fall-off of 2, we have a mist that hugs the ground quite nicely, but doesn't take up too much of the air above the ground. So with a low fall-off, the mist covers a lot of the air as well and gives us these really high, bright spots. I usually use a height fall-off quite high, so that we have a sort of low mist ground that doesn't take up too much of the sky. Next up is the in-scattering color, and that's essentially the color of the fog. So if the fog was to have a very blue in-scattering, we would see blue fog, and if we were to make red scattering color, we would see the fog tint slightly towards the red. You might have noticed that something strange is happening with the reflections in the water and the fog. As soon as we added the fog, we have this sort of white band around the edge of the water. So far, in my experience, fog and transparent water doesn't work super well together. I think it's both a factor of the height fog extending below the actual water layer. So if I move the water down, we have all of this height fog within this depth, as well as, let's just undo that, as well as something going on with the reflections in a way that the reflection of the fog doesn't really take into account the fact that there's stuff in the way, and it's just reflecting as if there was endless fog. I might be wrong on that, but that's so far as I can tell. There are a few ways around this. One is to be very subtle with your fog effect. So if I was to go to Exponential Height Fog and turn the height fog down quite a little bit, so that it still applies to the scene and adds a little bit of depth, but it's not as noticeable along the edge of the water. Another way of getting around this is to keep your camera low to the ground, which might not be the best solution for you, but in that case the reflections of the fog look more just like a mirage, the fog that's hugging the surface of the lake. Another solution is, unfortunately, to not use transparency in your water. At the moment I'm using a single layer, and even though technically that's not transparent, it's still showing us what's underneath, and it's still causing a little bit of issue with this fog. So if I go to my water plane and open up my water material, it is unfortunate that we are undoing all of our wonderful work from the other day, where we created a single layer water material. But if I was to say increase the opacity of this water, and then at the same time increase the metallic, so it's more of a reflective surface, you can see that that gets rid of the strange reflections that were happening along the outside. If I start decreasing the opacity, those reflections, they might not even be reflections, it might just be the fog that's underneath, start coming back in. So perhaps you could balance a little bit of opacity so that you can still see the edge of the underneath of the water, but not have such a pronounced outline of the fog. As with most things, it's a balance. I now have some weird black outline on my water, which isn't amazing. But you know what? It's okay. I'm going to say 0.75, which means that I have transformed my lake from a see-through lake to a sort of mirror surface. And that's okay because, for the most part, I'm not going to be looking directly down into it. And even when I do, that is not terrible. I can still see underneath. That's my workaround, and as far as I can tell, whenever you're dealing with exponential height fog and sky atmosphere and a surface that is reflective and transparent, you're going to run into issues with your fog anyway. So that's how I'm going to deal with it today. Let's refresh this light, see what this all looks like. For the most part, I think my lighting is set up the way that I want it to be set up. So now let's move briefly into bringing in a camera. There are two types of camera. If we search for camera, there's a lot of stuff that happens, but the two actual rendering cameras in this selection are the normal camera. Let's just bring that in and we can see what that camera sees, and the CineCamera actor. So if we bring that in, oh, I lost it. CineCamera and camera. Close all of these. Clean up my scene a little bit and move exponential height fog into lighting. CineCamera actor, immediately, without even going into the settings, I can tell that when I click my camera actor, my frame rate drops to about 30 because my scene is not only rendering the scene once, it's also rendering it through the camera. But if I click my CineCamera, I'm in the red in terms of frame rate. So without even looking into it, I know that the camera actor is going to be a little bit easier on performance, whereas the CineCamera is probably doing some extra stuff that requires some performance hits. And that's sort of what's happening. The camera actor, if we look at the settings, is a great default camera that doesn't really worry too much about physical camera accuracy, but rather just the general stuff that you want from a camera, such as have a look at this viewport over here, field of view to zoom in and out, an aspect ratio to make the camera super widescreen or square if you're exporting for Instagram or something. And then under the camera options, we have a few things that we can do, such as constrain the aspect ratio regardless of screen size, lock to HMD if you are creating a VR experience. For the most part, those are the settings. They're very generic and very basic. The CineCamera, on the other hand, is a virtual camera that is designed to recreate the experience of using a top-of-the-line film cinema camera. The settings in this camera are a lot more involved, but also a lot more versatile. If you are creating a film in Unreal and you need your camera to be able to specify things like aperture and depth of field and focal distance, things like that, then definitely choose the CineCamera. If you're not super interested in that and you just need a camera to show your scene, then perhaps use the camera actor and don't worry too much about the cinema camera or all of the settings. The generic camera is pretty straightforward and relatively intuitive, so I'm not even going to cover it. Because I'm creating a cinematic scene here, I am going to be using the CineCamera. The first thing that I want to do is stop this double rendering, which is really killing my frame rate in the scene right now. I want to be able to see what the camera sees, not in this tiny window, but in the whole viewport. One way to do that is to right-click on the camera and say Pilot CineCamera Actor. And now you see what the camera sees, and when you use your viewport controls to move about, you are moving the camera itself. You can see that my frame rate is already a little bit unstable. Before piloting this camera, I was at about 60 frames per second, and now I'm at about 35, 36. So the cinema camera does come with some performance costs, which I'm going to deal with because I'm not rendering real time. If you are rendering real time, you might need to adjust some of your lighting, shadow map, and foliage settings. Alright, into the cinema camera actor. The first option is look at tracking settings. I'm not going to do this in my scene, but it's worth noting that you can basically point the camera to anything within your scene. If you have an actor that's moving around and you want to be able to follow that actor by panning towards it, this is the option for you. Since it's not pertinent to my scene, I'm going to skip over that for now. The film back, this is where you can set what type of film you are creating, all the way up to IMAX. If you know that you are creating a scene for IMAX, that might be something worth considering. I'm going to do 16:9 because that's a nice filmy standard. Next up are the lens settings, where we can set the type of lens that we use. Universal zoom allows us to specify a minimum focus length and a maximum focus length, and then through blueprints and scripts we can dynamically change between those zoom levels. Similarly, the minimum and maximum f-stop allow us to set minimum and maximum aperture values. In a real-life camera, the aperture or f-stop determines both the amount of light that's let in, so the brightness of your scene, as well as the depth of field, so how blurry things look when they're close or far, depending on what you're focusing on. Because at the beginning of this video we locked our exposure metering in at 1, the aperture is not going to change the brightness of our scene, but it will still have an influence on the depth of field, so what objects are in focus. To get more into the focus settings, let's close lens settings and open up focus settings. There are a couple of different focus methods. The first is manual, so we set where we are focusing in the scene, and the other is tracking. So just as we can move the camera to look at objects, we can also set what objects are in focus. I can use the slider to manually set exactly how far away I'm focusing, but I can also use the eyedropper tool in a wonder of technology to select somewhere in my scene what to focus on. So let's see what that looks like. The first thing that I need in my scene is something to focus on. Most of what's in my scene at the moment is foliage, which doesn't work too well with this eyedropper tool. So just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to search for the mannequin. Oh, you know what? I know where it is. Mannequin character mesh. Because I have surface snapping on, I can enter my move tool and start dragging this guy around. About the same size as grass, which means that my scale is slightly off, but that's okay. I'm not going to worry about that right now. With my cinema actor selected, let's go back to those focus settings and start seeing what some of these things do. With my current focal length, I'm going to change that to about 50. 50 is a nice normal lens. And also decrease the aperture just to accentuate the depth of field differences to something around maybe 1.3. You can already start to see that we have some depth of field blurring happening on this actor who's really close. And the landscape in the background is looking pretty sharp. With our manual focus distance, we can either manually drag and change the distance of what's being focused on, or we can use this eyedropper tool to select an object in the scene and snap focus to that object. If you've ever done any focus pulling in your life, this tool is game-changing. The rest of these options are just about refining and tweaking these focus settings. For now, although 50 gives us a really nice depth of field, it is not necessarily the lens that I want for my landscape, so I'm going to reset the focus settings and choose a lens of about 24, maybe. Actually, you know what? Let's go back to probably 18. I'll delete the mannequin because I no longer need him. And that is that. That's the bulk of the settings for the CineCamera. But don't forget that we also have a whole plethora of things that we can change within our post-processing volume. At the beginning, we changed only one thing, which was that auto exposure metering. But if we go back into the post-processing volume, there are a ton of other options to change as well. If we wanted to add additional bloom to our scene, we can start increasing and decreasing the intensity of the bloom. We have a whole lot of other options in terms of chromatic aberration, lens flares, image effects, and depth of field. I would say if you are using the CineCamera, this depth of field option is very sparse, and I wouldn't suggest using it because the CineCamera has those really specific settings where you can adjust that sort of thing. Excellent. So we've set up our camera with the settings that we want in terms of depth of field, aperture, and lens. Now let's talk about moving the camera around. So far, to move our camera, we have right-clicked on the camera actor and said pilot the camera. And that gives us a one-to-one correlation between what we see in the viewport and what the camera sees. This is great, and it's a great way to start moving around the scene, but it also lacks a little bit of control, or precision rather. For example, if I want a very intricate camera movement that's out of a James Cameron film where the camera orbits around a specific object at a specific speed, setting it up using these WASD controls and the mouse look and that sort of thing is possible, but not exactly easy. To remedy that, there is a specific type of actor that we will look into called a camera rig. There are two types of these rigs. One is a crane and one is a rail. Both of them try to replicate real-world camera constructions, either cameras that move along a specific track or cameras that get put on the end of a big boom arm and get moved around the scene by swinging that boom arm around. Both serve a unique purpose, and today I will show you the rail just because we are running out of time, and maybe I'll do the crane in another video. So dragging the rail into our scene, press F to frame onto the rail. We have what looks like, if we pull this up a little bit, what looks like a set of two train tracks with a little thing on top of the train tracks. The way that this rail works is once we attach a camera, which we haven't done yet, we have the option to change the current position on the rail from 0 to 1. 0 being one end of the rail, 1 being the other end of the rail. And as we slide this position between the two, the camera rig, or where the camera is going to be, will lock to that position along the rail. The way that we change this rail and change the shape of it is by clicking on each of these endpoint handles and moving the handles around. So for instance, in this case, I can move this handle out along this way, or bring it in and move it out along the other way. And I think I'm going to do that because I want my camera to start far back over here and then move in to this area over here, revealing the lake. So I want to select the end handle and move it all the way down to that area over there. At the moment, the gizmo itself is a little bit small for me, so I'm going to increase the scale of the gizmo so that it's easier to see and select in my scene. If I scale it up about 10, that's a little bit easier. If you select the whole thing and move it, then you're moving the entire rig itself. And then if you select the little white handles, 2 Bezier curve handles will activate, and you can move the actual end point itself. As I move the end point, the Bezier curve handles create a bit of a curve in the track, and you can use the curve handles to create more organic custom shapes in your camera rig. For now, I want to keep the beginning part of the rig a little bit straight, so I think I will move the end point to about there. Are we limited to just 2 endpoints, a start and an end? Absolutely not. We can create a new section of track by holding down the Alt key, or Option if you're on a Mac, and then dragging out from an endpoint, and we will create a new endpoint, and we can do that as many times as we need. I like to keep my tracks as sparse as possible and only add key handles where absolutely necessary. So I think I'll start all the way over here, and then we'll end around here. At the moment, I'm just constructing the big shape of what I want. Later on, we can go in and refine the specific movements where necessary. For now, all I know is that I want to start back there and end up over here. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is attach the camera to this. And the process of doing that is very, very simple. All we do is drag the camera in to the camera rig, and now the camera rig recognizes that this is a camera and we should move the camera along this rail. Let's start adjusting the current position on rail and see what happens. Okay, something's happening, but it's not exactly what we want. The camera seems to be moving and following the position of the rail, but it's in the wrong position. So do I need to go in and move this camera to the right position? Not necessarily. If I select the camera actor, the transform is now relative to the camera rail. So if I reset the transform by hitting reset location, reset position, my camera is now in the start position of the rail. The rotation is not exactly where I want it, so I might want to go in and adjust the rotation to be pointing along the rail itself, and maybe create a bit of an offset along the z-axis. But now, once I've done that, as I move the position along the rail of the camera, it's following the rail. It's following the rail without changing its rotation, so it's always looking straight ahead. If we wanted more of a roller coaster type situation, where as the rail moves, the camera follows along, we can lock the orientation to rail, and then with our CineCamera. And now, as we move along the rail, we have more of that roller coaster effect, where the camera follows along the path of the rail. I don't want that. I want to be able to freely control the rotation of the camera. So I'm going to uncheck lock rotation to rail and have a camera that I can fully control. Now that we've set up the rail, we can begin to go in and refine the camera movement. You can do this while on the rail, so move to a specific point and then say, you know what, I want this to be a little bit lower down, and carefully move that rail down. Or you can stop piloting the camera by right-clicking and saying stop piloting CineCamera. And now, when we move our camera back, there's our CineCamera, there's our rig, and if I click away just to increase my frame rate a little bit, we can now manually adjust each point as necessary. So what I think I'm going to do is move this point a little closer to the start and Alt-click to drag out a new point, just so that our final point here has a bit of a area to sort of flatten out. We can pilot the camera actor again, go back into our camera rig, and see what that generally looks like. Okay, I don't like that bump, so instead something like that. For the sake of expediency right now, I'm going to call it at that, but I would love to spend a lot more time refining and tweaking those camera movements. Now that we have our camera rig set up with the general shape of movements that we want, let's go in and actually start pacing out those movements. One way to think of animation is changing something over time. Position, rotation, light intensity, almost anything that you can change in Unreal, you can animate, so change that over time. We need something to keep track of these changes over time. The way that Unreal handles that is called the sequencer. You can think of a sequence as a video editor's timeline, where you can take video clips, move them around, edit them together, stretch them out, compress them, add new clips, delete old clips, etc., etc. Except in this case, instead of only being used for video clips, you can use the sequencer for any sort of time-based change in Unreal. To add a sequence, all we need to do is go to the Cinematics tab in the top of your window and say Add Level Sequence. There is another option to add a master sequence, because you can have multiple sequences per level to control different things. In my case, I'm going to keep it simple and just have one level sequence to control everything in my level. I'm going to save this into a folder called Sequences that I created earlier, and I already have a sequence in there, but I'm going to create a new one. Call this, well, I already have Lakeview, so Cinematic Demo is what I'm going to call it. And now we have a new sequencer window open. If you don't have the sequencer window open, or you close it and you've lost it, you can always go back to that sequence that you saved. Mine's called Cinematic Demo. Double click on that and your sequencer window will open. Here is the timeline that I was talking about. At the end of this, we will have a number of different tracks controlling different changes in our scene. For now, though, the only change that I want to keep track of is the camera movement. Now that we have a sequencer, we can begin to record changes over time to almost any editable parameter in our scene. For instance, if I click on the camera rail, previously I've been moving the camera by sliding the current position on rail from 0 to 1. But now, because I have a sequencer, I have the option to record that transition over a certain amount of time. Since we've added the sequencer, a new icon has appeared next to many of the parameters in our objects. And that icon looks like a little diamond with a tiny plus on the top right. If we hover over that, that says adds keyframe for this property to the current animation. Let's click that and see what happens. By clicking that, we've added a new track to our sequencer, which is just a link between the sequencer and a specific object in the scene. That object also has one of its parameters exposed, the current position on rail, which is the object that we added the keyframe for. And there is one keyframe in the track, at position 0, 0. We can now move the playhead ahead a little bit to about 3 seconds and change the current position on rail to 1, for example, and then hit add a new keyframe. And that will add a new keyframe at position 3, so 3 seconds into the sequence, and save the position data of that keyframe as 1. And now as we scrub back and forth between the two, the camera will animate from 0 to 1 over those 3 seconds. We can now use these play controls at the bottom, or just press spacebar to watch what that animation looks like. One or two things that can be handy to know at this point is we can select our keyframes and drag them around a little bit. So if I was to move this to position 5, that would slow down the camera movement because it's moving the same distance over a longer period of time. I can also change the length of my track. At the moment it's 5 seconds, but I might want my sequence to be 20 seconds. I can do that by clicking on the bottom right hand number over here, hovering over it says working range end, change that to something like 21, and I will have 21 seconds. Expand the sequence. Even though I've done that, the clip length itself is still only 5 seconds, and I need to adjust the in and out points of this entire track. So to change the length of the track itself, I'll need to drag the red end point of the track out to about 20 as well. And now when I play, even though the keyframe ends at 5 seconds, the sequence will continue playing up to 20. Another thing that can be helpful to know is that there is an option to auto keyframe. The way that I just showed you how to keyframe is to go into the parameter, change the parameter to the number that you want, and then hit record keyframe. If you enable auto key, then as soon as you begin to change the parameter, a keyframe will create and it will save whatever you've changed it to. This can be very helpful because it can speed things up. It can also be very confusing because if I move my playhead somewhere and I say, what's the camera like over here? Even though I didn't intend to record a keyframe, it has. So just be careful that you have auto keyframe on only when you need it to be on. I'm going to now move the keyframe that is at position 1 all the way to the end of my clip. I'm now going to right click and pilot my camera again and hit play on the sequencer to see what my sequence looks like. That's actually not too bad. I think seeing it now, I do want to go into my camera actor and reduce the focal length a little bit just to expose more of the lake. The other thing that I want to do is add a rotation to the camera. So maybe once we get to about here, pan the camera just a little bit to expose this, to pan away from this gross edge of the lake. So to do that, I'm going to try and repeat the steps that we made to create an animation on the camera rail position. So I'll select my CineCamera actor, go to the transform tab and try to keyframe. Oh no, there's no little keyframe button next to it. That's okay. There's many different ways that we can keyframe things. This other way that I'm going to show you involves dragging the actor itself onto the sequence, which will create a new track. A lot of stuff just happened. One is that the sequencer recognized this actor as a camera and also gave us a camera track. I'll talk about that in a second, but for now, what I'm most interested in is the orange highlighted CineCamera Actor tab, which when we drop down, we get a whole bunch of components on the camera itself. So we can animate those components if we want, but what I'm actually interested in is if I collapse the camera component and open the transform, now I have access to the rotation, the roll, pitch, and yaw. Noting that I have auto keyframe on, I'm going to start my animation, start my rotation change about here. So create a keyframe by pressing the little plus button next to each roll, pitch, yaw. And once I am about here, maybe rotate my camera down a little bit. Give it a little bit of breath and then as I come into the end, look towards the sun. That's fine. So that's just another way of adding keyframes, dragging the object into the sequencer, and then scrolling down to find what you need to animate. If there is a component that isn't already exposed, we can expose new parameters to animate by clicking the plus track option on the actor itself, which will then expose all of the things that we can add to the animator, to the clip. For now, that's pretty good, and I think I'm good on the camera. The last thing that I'll mention before I move on to the lighting is this camera cuts option. What the camera cuts allows us to do is have multiple cameras in our scene and cut between them. So you can set up real-time cinematics with multiple camera angles and cut between each. In our case, we only have one camera, but this tool can still be useful because it is another way to view what our camera is seeing. So if I stop piloting the camera and click out so that I've lost where my camera is, I can now click on the lock viewport to camera cuts option, which is the camera icon next to the camera cuts option. And now I'm not piloting the camera, but my viewport is showing me what the output of the sequencer sees. So without having to go in and pilot the camera each time, once I lock my viewport to the camera, I can see what the camera is seeing and all of the animations involved in this sequence. This can get a little confusing if you forget that you've left it on and start moving the timeline and you think, oh my goodness, why can't I move my own camera around? Make sure to uncheck that camera icon when you need to start moving things around again. Awesome. The last thing that I'm going to animate right now is the lighting. In the same way that I animated the camera, I'm going to take the directional light from my scene, drag it in to the sequencer, and then search for the transform component. Right now there is no transform option available, so I'm going to hit plus track on the directional light tab and then hit transform, and now I have the transform options, location and rotation. Because I'm only interested in rotation, I will click the rotation tab and keyframe that rotation level, which will add a keyframe for all three options. Let's expand rotation just so that I have all those options there. Move to the beginning of the scene and choose a starting rotation for the sunlight. Using my Control L option, let's add a late afternoon sun and see what that looks like from the camera's viewport. Don't forget to refresh the blueprint sky sphere when you need to. And there we go. At the beginning of my scene, the sun is sort of just above the horizon. I'm going to go ahead and keyframe that rotation in. If you hit the keyframe on the rotation itself, it will keyframe both. It will keyframe all three: pitch, roll, and yaw. Then, at about 14 seconds, I want the sun to dip just on the horizon over there. Maybe a little to the left. You know what, that's good enough for now. We can come in and tweak. Hit that keyframe. That was interesting. Even though I had moved the sun, the keyframe itself was not updating. I think that's because you need to actually adjust within the details panel for that auto keyframing to work. Good to know. All right, let's see what the camera sees as we move from beginning to end. What's happening now is exposing the fundamental problem of the blueprint sky sphere, which is that every time we want to update where the sun is, we have to click refresh material. And we can't really do that at 24 frames a second, at least not manually. So we need a way to be able to update this refresh material on the fly so that each frame step, the sun's position will update. One way that we can do this is by editing the blueprint sky sphere's blueprint. To do that, go to the blueprint sky sphere and hit edit blueprint. This will open up a drop-down menu and we will choose open blueprint editor. For now, this might all look intimidating, and that's okay. All we need to do is go to the event graph, and I already have it from previously. The blueprints are a way for us to control what happens to an object as the game progresses. And one of the fundamental nodes that we have access to is the event tick node, which if we hover over it, it's called every frame. So this event will run every frame, and everything connected to this event will run along in that frame. Specific to this blueprint sky sphere are a number of functions that we could, if we wanted to, double click into, and there's some stuff that's happening. Fortunately, we don't need to though, because the naming of these functions is very helpful. Update sun direction and refresh material. My guess, even though I might not have gone into this and passed through all the code, is that this refresh material function corresponds to this refresh material button. So what I think I can do, let's see if it works, is drag the refresh material function into our blueprint nodes and then connect our event tick to the refresh material. That means that, if I'm right, every frame our blueprint itself is going to automatically click the refresh material button. Let's compile that, save, and see what happens. Right now, nothing happens. We still need to click refresh material to update the position of the sun. This is because, unfortunately, the event tick from earlier doesn't happen in the editor. We need to be running the game for those event ticks to fire. Fortunately, we can simulate the game running by going to the drop-down menu under play and hit simulate, or just press Alt-S. Once we do that, the simulation of the game will be running, so all the event tick nodes will be called. And now, because we're simulating, when we scrub back and forth, that blueprint sky sphere is going to be automatically updating. One important thing to note about the simulate mode is that changes that you make to an object are not saved. For instance, if I was to go into my exponential height fog and say, you know what, I want my fog to actually be red, and that creates this reddish glow around my scene. Once I hit stop, the height fog pops back to what it was before. Confusingly, this is not the case for keyframes. So if I was to say my sun actor actually is going to come, let's be in simulate mode, and my sun actor is going to do a little bit of a loop-de-loop and pop over there. Once I save my keyframe, now even when I stop, that keyframe is going to be saved. So keyframes are saved, but changes to an object that aren't keyframed are not saved. One way to get around that is if I'm in simulate mode and I go to my exponential height fog and I say, you know what, I really want a nice reddish fog. And now that I'm in simulate mode, I can be playing around and tweaking these values. And I want to save these values. All I have to do is right-click on the object before I leave simulate mode and hit keep simulation changes. And those will keep the changes that I made during simulation mode. I don't want to do that right now, so I'll hit stop and revert back to how I was before. Alright, now with the simulate mode and the camera cuts mode, I really have a lot of flexibility to tweak my scene as I need to. So when I press simulate, I can move my sun around and see where the sun is going to be, and with the camera cuts mode I can see exactly what the camera is seeing. So let's go to the directional light and give an end point to this sunset, sending it down below the horizon. Keyframing that rotation over there. Small caveat, this is absolutely not a physically accurate sunset because it sort of pops off to the distance. Actually, I think I'll delete that keyframe and say move it just straight down rather than across. That transition is a little bit wonky, so one thing that I can do is with my rotation selected, or whatever you are keyframing, click the icon that looks like a bit of a wavy graph, and this will bring up the animation graph where you can compare how where you can see how your animations look in graph form. This is where you can really come in and fine-tune the transitions between keyframes. For instance, this yaw looks fine, there's a nice smooth curve between those two options, but the pitch has a bit of a divot in it, so I might want to go in and change the way that this slope transitions between the two keyframes. You can also right-click on each keyframe and fine-tune exactly how the keyframe, how the transition between those keyframes looks. For example, a linear is a straight line, whereas a auto brings out flattens that curve out a little bit, and user allows me to go in and change this as I want. I think I'm going to leave it at that. Actually, auto, save that, go back, and I think I should have gotten rid of the strange little bump in the transition right there. Let's go back into the camera editor, see what this all looks like coming together. Yeah, that's pretty good. I have noticed, let me just stop this simulation. I have noticed that right at the end I can start to see a bit of the edge of the world, the horizon. So I will go in and take my camera rig, and at the end here, move these two down quite a bit. Yeah, let's see what that looks like with simulate mode on, so that I can see the sun. Okay, so I'm a little sad that the sun moves behind the horizon just before I see the lake, so what I might do is go to my light actor and start moving these keyframes around a little bit. Cool. Now let's go back into the curve editor, see this roll, this pitch, so that's way too intense. And this yaw, also a little much. So one thing I've noticed is that when it's dark, when it gets dark, the fog issue that I was talking about on the water becomes a little bit more transparent. So there are a couple of things that I can do with the timeline to remedy that. One is to go to my Exponential Height Fog, which is over here, and I am still in simulation mode, just be aware. From about here, where the sun dips below the horizon, we can keyframe our density of the fog and then by the time it gets dark, move that density way down to something that's not really that noticeable. And then as this light fades, it's almost as if the fog scattering around fades as well. I also want to extend this animation a little bit. Give it time to breathe and settle in its final form. So I'm going to Since I extended the clip beyond the current camera cut, I do need to extend that camera cut a little, otherwise the scene won't know what camera to use. So I always need to make sure that the camera fills the entire clip. And then also I might want to extend some of these keyframes, such as the light transform, or the light rotation. All I'm doing is dragging these keyframes to the end, to the 27 mark, for pitch and for yaw. You could also go in and keyframe them manually. Anyway, the rest of this process is just tweaking keyframes. But for the most part this looks okay, and I think I am, to save myself a little bit of sanity, going to render this out. You know what, I'm going to do one more tiny tweak change, which is that this water, instead of getting rid of the height fog, which is one way we can deal with the water, I think I kind of want the height fog in the scene. So I will delete the last keyframe there, I will delete the fog density entirely, remove exponential height fog as a track. Just make sure that under exponential height fog we do have the correct setting still. And instead I'm going to bring in I'm going to open up the water material, and because I can't really see, let me just pull that aside for a second. Because I can't really see the depths of that water anyway, we're not really having the benefit of the opacity of this water layer. So I'm just going to set the opacity at 1, which means that the water will be a perfect mirror, and we will not have those fog issues, fog refraction issues, or whatever's going on with the fog over there. I will now render this out and splice it in at the very beginning to show you what it looks like, to entice you to watch this video. The process for doing that is remarkably straightforward. There is this little slate icon next to the camera, and if you hover over that, it says render this movie to a video or image frame sequence. Once you hit that, we get a new window with all of the options, what type of movie you want to create, whether to output any audio. I don't have any audio in my scene, so I won't be doing that. I use custom frame rate. If you don't check that, then the default frame rate of the project, which is 30, which I'm actually going to change now to 24, just to be a little bit more cinematic. The resolution, I'm going to choose 1920 by 1080. That's entirely up to you and what your project requires. Burn-in settings can be useful. This will embed a bunch of information into the video itself, which can be super helpful if you're rendering lots of shots or asking for help on something. I will keep that off for now. Video settings, just some compression. Depending on what option you choose up here, you will have different options under video settings. General lets you choose where you want to output your file to and how the file will be named. And then sequence isn't super useful unless you're editing to an external video editor. I'll skip that for now. Cinematic, if you check these two options, you will get an output of the highest quality. And lastly, animation. This is sort of important. If you have things like particle effects, or even the landscape, if you have a lot of foliage, sometimes the landscape can take a few frames to load after you press play. So the warm-up frame count is a way to say, load your scene before the animation begins to play. It's always safe to add a few frames of warm-up. I'm going to give a second of warm-up just to make sure that everything settles in before the animation begins. Then there's some delay stuff. Delay every frame can be really important. For instance, let's have a look at the transition when the sky goes dark in this section over here. It looks to me as though something is taking a while to catch up to the rest of the frame when I make big transitions from light to dark. And my best guess is that is the skylight capture, which we set to real time. So it can be helpful to add a little bit of a delay between every frame that's rendered, so that things like that, so that the reflection capture and the post-processing, the words that they use are settle down, all your effects to settle down in the frame between each frame. So this will slow down your render, because your render might not be real time, as there's an intentional delay between each frame, but it can also help output the highest image quality. I'm going to add a delay of 0.05 seconds between each frame, and then we are ready to render. We'll need to stop the simulation and capture movie. And once you click play, your scene will begin to render. It's quite slow because I put that intentional pause, but generally this will render at real time, or at least very close to real time, which is pretty damn cool. Okay, that's it. We're done. Gosh. If you have stuck around this long, congratulations. That's quite a feat. I barely made it through myself. I certainly hope that this has helped in your own dynamic outdoor lighting journey in Unreal. Let me know your thoughts. Good luck with your own projects, and take care.